Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of South Asian Success. Here at South Asian Success, we are talking to people that are rooted in culture, career, they're building, they're creators, they're founders, and in this case, professors. So we want to highlight our community doing really unique things. But what makes this conversation so special to talk to Dr. Vijay Mehrotra is Vijay, you're one of the earliest folks in the US of our South Asian heritage, right? And I know I'm kind of calling you out in that way, but the journey for you is a really rich one and we're going to get to dig in. So I'm so glad to have you here. Thank you for joining.
Thanks for the invitation. Happy to be here.
So let's talk a little bit about that. Talk about you. Who are you, your work, your kind of life? Tell us a little fun facts about yourself, anything that you want to impart on the audience.
Well, I think probably the thing to impress on the audience, this particular audience, is I really feel like I've been working really hard my entire career to manage, achieve, and exceed the expectations of my Indian parents who sacrificed so much as immigrants. And also at the same time, kind of trying to find my own voice and my own space and the things that bring me joy and satisfaction. And so I do feel like I've got to work twice as hard because I got two benchmarks and two rulers. And I hear that a lot from women friends, actually, that are professionals, that they feel the same way, that they've got benchmarks as women as well as professionals that they've got to go up against. So I know that mine is not kind of strictly unique in that sense, but I think that that's in a way the defining characteristic of my journey is that I've been really trying to be respectful to both my parents' heritage and capabilities and expectations of me, as well as my own sense of joy and my own sense of kind of finding my own self and pursuing the things that make me happy.
I love that. And so you are a professor, and we're going to dive into the career a little bit more. And it sounds like your father was also was a professor, maybe retired now. Let's tell us a little bit about your family life and growing up in America. You shared with me that your dad came to America before officially the Immigration Act was even passed. So I'd love to hear kind of what is that like for those of us that I think of myself, probably like one kind of generation next, right? From that.
Yes.
Sounds like. So share a little bit about your family, that experience. What was that like during that time?
Well, it is, it's an interesting story that I've really only heard bits and pieces of over the years. And just as my father's in his 90s now, we've had some more time to talk about those things. Worth mentioning that my father studies the psychology of aging. That's his area of expertise.
Wow.
And he's still working at 93 because he recognizes the importance of that. He's still supervising students and listening to dissertation defenses and things.
Amazing.
But my father, after finishing his studies in India in the 50s, worked for many years, most of that time for the Indian military, helping them select officers. He'd gotten into and had discovered psychology, which was a really new field in the 1950s. And eventually, through some people that he met, was encouraged to apply to school and was accepted to Columbia and Ohio State, but took the offer at Ohio State because there were less strings attached. He arrived in September of 1965, and the Immigration Act was passed in October. So his expectations for immigrating to the U.S. didn't exist when he got here, and the world sort of opened up. The other thing that's sort of fun is he then found a job on campus that paid $30 a month more, and
Wow.
So I arrived here in 1966, just before my second birthday.
Wait, in Columbus, Ohio, because
Columbus, Ohio, yes.
I was born in Columbus, Ohio, and so
I did not know that.
I think we missed that connection. And
Wow.
yes, wonderful.
Yeah, so then we moved to Chicago. My dad had a research job for ETS, the people that put out the SAT exam, and he faced a lot of prejudice. As a foreigner, was sent on some of the worst assignments and just treated really badly at work. My mom was really homesick, and even though we were, at this point, permanent residents, they were looking pretty seriously at going back to India. And then my dad got a phone call from a nun in Minnesota. Her little college in Duluth was looking for a psychology professor, and they'd gotten his resume somehow. To this day, we don't know how. He didn't know where Duluth was, but he got a plane there for an interview, and he came back just talking about how nice the people were. And we moved there in the fall, and my parents were there for the next 50 plus years before retiring to Florida. And my dad eventually, became chair of the psychology department, then dean of the school, built a lot of new graduate programs, and also kind of developed this deep expertise in the psychology of aging. And that's been kind of his area of research and his area of passion for a long time. That, I think, connects for our audience because I was raised in an environment where, of course, you create a new program, you see a need, you create a new program. And that sort of is the mindset that I had many years later when we created our customer success track within our MBA program. So we'll get to that.
Yeah,
But
we'll get
in terms of the start of the journey, it was really incredibly fortuitous, both coming to the US for my dad and then the Immigration Act and the opportunity to stay. And there were no online websites to navigate the green card process or the naturalization process then. And I am just in awe, not just of my dad's hard work, but in his bureaucratic tolerance to navigate the machinery. I have no skills with that kind of thing.
Well, I also am just thinking for everyone listening, this resume landed in Minnesota from Chicago without email, without, any kind of was probably was literally somebody mailed this resume that they had a paper copy of to somebody else. How many paper copies of your resume did you even have back then? Right. So printing was probably more challenging. So I think about the turn of events that occurred and that
Yes.
it's such a unique one. And now knowing your career, it really does enlighten me a little bit on, kind of that inspiration starting in your father. That's really, really cool to hear. But look, we're going to dive into the career moments. Now, it sounds like you had a warm welcome in Minnesota, but there wasn't just warmth all around, right? So how was the initial community? What was happening there? Give us the yin and the yang, the kind of what was happening to you as a young person growing up in that environment.
Well, I mean, I think the best way to think about it is these are warm and loving people. The people of Minnesota are the salt of the earth. And you saw their commitment to their neighbors during the ice surge this winter in Minneapolis and really all over the state. And at the same time, they just were not. They'd had almost no exposure to foreigners. Very few of them had traveled. When I moved to the state, it was about 98% non-immigrant, 2% immigrant. My
Yeah.
hometown of Duluth was somewhere less than 1%. My neighbors had never met a foreigner. Most of my my classmates had never had a friend with dark skin. Our family was kind of an exotic family to them. I remember my mother coming in one day at the request of some of my female classmates and teaching the girls to tie a sari. And they thought this was the coolest thing in the world. I just had dinner with a couple of them on Sunday night, and they're still talking about it. This story comes up.
That's a core memory for them. I love that.
So, so there was some amount of bullying and some amount of, name calling and stuff. And I think at some level, it just was a matter of unfamiliarity more than anything else. And to be fair, also a little bit of an absence of curiosity on the part of some of them. And at the same time, I mean, these people were the salt of the earth. My father's car got stuck in a snowdrift the first winter we were there. He had no experience driving in the snow. 20 of my neighbors, some of them people we'd never met before, were out there digging him out cheerfully. Nobody asked them to come. Nobody organized it. They just said, my neighbor needs help. This is what we do.
Well, that's amazing. I mean, I grew up in the Midwest, so I can completely relate to, kind of feeling the warmth of community, but also feeling like an outsider at the same time. There's this interesting dichotomy. And I think you say that, when you were young, you almost struggled with that cultural identity, right? But you credit maybe different mentors or different influences in your life to helping you sort of pursue your personal path, right? Could you share a little bit about what is it? I mean, what is going through a young man's life as they're in this community where you kind of feel like I think a lot of us is like just fit in, right? You kind of want to that seems like
Yeah.
this course. How did you navigate
Well, I mean, I think the biggest thing that I did is I was just out of the house all the time.
that?
I got involved with as much stuff as I could: theater, baseball, golf, a zillion part-time jobs. I knew kids all over the city, even if they didn't go to school with me. If I met them at summer camp, they were my friend for life. So I sort of discovered that I was an extreme extrovert. And that was sort of my education, cultural education, was just being out there all the time in these different contexts. And and I had teachers along the way and coaches that sort of encouraged me. One that got me involved with theater, another one that encouraged me to write. And then when I went away to college, the college I chose was because of a charismatic professor who I met on a campus visit. Ted Vesey was the chair of the math department at St. Olaf College. He was also coach of the ski team. He also led the term in the Far East a time or two. And he was an inspiration to me. I showed up in his office as a prospective student telling him that I wanted to go to business school and make a bunch of money. And he didn't bat an eye. He said, well, let me tell you about one of my former students who came here and studied and went to Stanford Business School and now works for McKinsey in Australia. What I learned later on was that student, Jeff Brown, had come to St. Olaf thinking he wanted to get a PhD. As Ted got to know him, he nudged him in a different direction based on his personality and temperament. And similarly, I showed up thinking I wanted to just do this math thing because it would help me go get an MBA. And over time, he figured out that, I really did have an affection for teaching and that I had kind of a willingness to work hard. And he said, look, you can always go to business school, but you might want to try graduate school in mathematical sciences. And if you get in, they'll pay you to go.
Yeah.
And because I remember this conversation as I was a sophomore and I was kind of just lost with kind of who I was and where I was going. And Ted said, look, just keep working hard. And if you keep doing what you're doing, we've got a good chance of getting you into this PhD program at Stanford. And you can move to California for free. And that was the dream at that point. And it was amazing to have somebody who believed in me before I, was really equipped to believe in myself. And I was really lucky. The quality of people I was surrounded with, both growing up and in college, was just exceptional. And I did eventually make it to Stanford.
I know. That's awesome. And so, we'll talk a little bit about your journey in academically and career. And so it sounds like you had to set out a path for yourself, like many of us do, is like, I actually set out to be a doctor when I was 18 years old, and I am not a doctor and I never even got the PhD. But, do you think back? I'm curious, knowing your father's a professor, knowing that you had that in your family, that heritage a little bit, was that at all a contributing factor in this decision? Like, as you're seeing this professor who's highlighting your strengths, were you also like, oh, and yes, I've seen what this career is like, or anything like draw you to it?
I would say actually, let's kind of get to the truth. I'm about to turn 62 years old. So I was going to college in the early 1980s, still at the very tail end of a world in the US where you went to work for a company for life.
Yeah.
Corporate employment was seen as really desirable and filled with opportunity. And I had the good fortune of hating it. I spent 2 summers as a college student, one working as an actuarial intern at an insurance company and one working in a technology sales office for IBM. And the content was one thing, but mostly just the size of the organizations it was really a turnoff to me. It was really hard to relate to people as individuals outside of the corporate context. And interns, we were clearly not high on anybody's dance card for lunch meetings. But what was changing at that same time was the lifetime employment model was going away. Somewhere between 1984, when AT&T broke up, and 1987, where the stock market crash led to IBM laying people off for the first time in its almost 100 years history. That model kind of blew up, and I was really lucky that I hadn't fell for it, and that it hadn't called me because I would have lost something there. So instead, when I applied to graduate school, I had a zillion ideas of what I might do. But when I visited Stanford as a prospective student, the department chair really, he was puzzled. He was like, well, what do you plan to do with your life? I was only 22 years old, so I wasn't going to tell him I had no idea or too many ideas. I just started talking. I said, well, here's what I want to do. I want to come here. I want to study with you guys. I want to contribute to the research. And then I want to take what I learned in school and go out in the real world and apply it and learn new things. And then somewhere down the road, take what I learned in school and what I learned in the real world and come back and teach all of that. And this guy had never spent a day outside of academia. He thought this was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. And he asked me, when do you imagine that you would come back to life as a professor? And again, I'm 22 years old. I have no idea. I told him about age 40. Because 40 is as far in the future as you can imagine at that time. Well, life is strange. Once you say something and get that idea or that vision planted in your head, it's a little bit harder to let go of. So after finishing my PhD and 12 years in tech, I started teaching at San Francisco State University a month before my 39th birthday, slightly ahead of schedule.
I think
And
this
I
is
was really lucky.
a vision board moment, right? It's like you didn't mean to do it, but it became something that your life like designed for you in a way. That's so interesting. Yeah.
And at that same time that I made that visit to Stanford as a college senior, I was also acting. I was doing Shakespeare at that time, and I'd sort of fallen in love with theater. And so that became part of that vision board. I've been performing as an actor, as an improviser, as a storyteller all along, all the way along. So when I was in PhD school and in the engineering, in an engineering department, I was also one night a week driving to San Francisco and studying improv.
Wow. Oh my gosh. Wow. So varied. I mean, so let's talk a little bit about this career path. I see this a lot with high achieving individuals. Like your career path is not necessarily linear, right? So you have your kind of liberal arts bachelor's, your engineering PhD, your tech entrepreneurship, you're now a business school professor officially, right? And
Yes.
then you're also doing startup advisory and angel investing. And on the side, you're doing arts and theater, right? What like how do these things sort of fit into the picture that is you, or how do they inform each other? I'm curious because I also have a super varied career path, but I always tell people like the every step of the way led to the next, right? And there was even though I didn't plan it, there was strategic value gained along the way. So I'm curious how your experiences all fit together.
A couple of thoughts. I think one thing that I've sort of come to learn later in life is that my actual kind of natural art form, or creative form, is collage,
Oh,
and overlaying different things on top of one another in a way that only makes sense to me. And so I do literally physical collage as an art form
wow, that's
as,
amazing.
as well. But my career has definitely been kind of shaped by being a liberal arts student. In PhD school, the objective is to sort of train you on a lot of very deep technical skills within your area, and then for you to find a problem that you can dig into really, really deeply. And even in that work, I wasn't very good at it. First and foremost, the idea of digging into something mathematical very deeply. I used to think I wasn't because I wasn't all that smart, but now I'm sort of understanding later in life that it just sitting and working on problems in a solitary way it doesn't play well for me as an extreme extrovert. So even my dissertation, what's notable, there's not very much that's notable about my dissertation, but what is notable about it is I sort of saw a problem that somebody had presented to me, and I saw some machinery, mathematical machinery to solve it that was way on the other side of the field, that no one had sort of seen those two connections. And in fact, my advisor and another professor on my committee had been in the same department for 20 years, but because their work was so far off, they'd never actually supervised a student together.
Mm.
But I had brought them together. I'd kind of brought the two components. That's what was notable, and that's traditionally what's been notable about everything I do. So when I started a consulting firm, I brought a friend who was very much an analytic mathematical modeling person and a friend who was a software developer together with me. And we started basically to pursue prospects while I still had a full-time job. And when we landed a whale that gave us 3 months to give it a try, I quit my job to kind of go do this. But I think at every step along the way, I was making choices that were going to help me later on make the transition I wanted to make.
Yeah.
So while I was working in tech, I was also coming to Purdue once a year to be an instructor in their call center campus, which was an exec ed kind of continuing ed format for people that worked in the call center industry. I was a math, forecasting, statistics, machine learning person, but I had gathered a bunch of domain knowledge in call centers and was able to connect the math to how you do operational planning and execution in call centers and service operations. And that's what I would come to teach about at Purdue. And I published a couple of papers. So when the time came to make the transition back to being a professor, and it's probably worth mentioning that I did a whole bunch of things in a hurry. We sold our consulting firm. I got engaged. I got married. I changed careers to become a professor, and I had a child all in 18 months' time. And 22 years later, I'm still recovering from all those changes at once. But it was very organic for me to make that move because I had published some research papers, even though that was not valued in tech. It was with an eye to the future. I've been writing a magazine column in a magazine that was targeted to academics, talking about the connection between their research and the real world. And so I had been doing these things in preparation for the next thing, sometimes consciously and sometimes unconsciously. And so that's kind of how I got from being a PhD student and a researcher to a tech entrepreneur to a professor.
I love it. I mean, and it's so I think of it and I tell people it's like the linear career path is fine, and many people have done it, and it makes a lot of sense. But the nonlinear career path, I think it almost like informs the next. Like every time you're speaking, I'm getting more information about what maybe formed your different stages and paths. So I want to ask you, obviously your PhD is in operations research. How are you somebody that is well, first of all, inform us about what is operations research, but then how are you starting the world's first academic program focused on customer success? I'm seeing some of these building blocks in call centers and things. Let's continue the journey here for us a little bit.
Okay. Yes. So I can tell you how operations research led to customer success. I think that's maybe the most linear telling of that I can is I worked at a consulting firm, my first job out of graduate school that really specialized in applying mathematical models to complex business problems, pricing, scheduling, things that were just mathematically messy. And the field of operations research was very much about bringing mathematics to bear on complex problems. It was founded during World War II in the context of how do we use limited resources to have the maximum impact. And a bunch of mathematicians and physicists sort of came together to work for the military to try to solve these problems. And after the war, then this field kind of emerged as around ideas of optimization, decision making. And unfortunately, kind of in academia, you advance by being theoretical. And so the field, even though it had these very deeply applied roots, very quickly became quite theoretical. And also, it's worth saying that to solve these problems with the computing tools of the 1950s and the 1960s on scale was really hard. And so I was kind of nudged into this field by my undergraduate advisor because he sort of recognized I was interested in business and I was interested in math. And when I got out, I was working at a consulting firm where so much of what we had to do was just data engineering. That the algorithmic components were small relative to the amount of work you need to do to find, clean, structure the data. And that's the case for what's become data science. You hear that same story. 70, 80, 90% of the effort is in the data prep and the data engineering. I didn't like that. I was interested in the business side and impacting business decision making. And so as it happened, one of my friends was building a forecasting model to predict the number of calls coming into call centers for a large company. It was a student
Hmm.
project. And when he got in there, he realized the problem wasn't the forecasting. The problem was, what do you do with the forecast? How do you operationalize around it? All this information coming in. This company was getting 2 million phone calls a year. What was the information in those calls that could go back into product improvement to reduce the overall cost of support? So again, this is in the on-premise days.
Hmm.
And so these were all themes that you hear about in customer success.
Yeah.
And so it was the mathematics of forecasting and then eventually of scheduling that brought us into this domain of services management that then eventually led me to partner with a software company that was selling into this space and then eventually coming on, bringing my team in and running professional services for them for a couple of years. So when I sold the company and finished my kind of employment contract and went into becoming a professor, I just thought I was done with the whole software industry. 15 years later, 14 years later, I was asked to create a new initiative for our MBA program. And they gave me kind of free rein. They said, here are the specifications. It should be globally important and locally significant in the Bay Area. It should be a career that is worthy of MBA students and create opportunities for them to grow and go forward in different directions. And it should be cross-disciplinary. And so what I learned by kind of doing a little poking around was that a number of my former MBA students had become CSMs in the period from about 2010 to 2017 when we started our program. So I got a bunch of them together to talk about what they do. And because of my background with professional services and implementation, I understood immediately once they explained what customer success was and what its business purpose was. And the last thing they said is, we will help you get established in this community. We will introduce you to people, we'll help you build relationships. And so that's kind of the journey from studying this very mathematical thing to then starting this customer success program. And the full circle part of this is one of the things that I've been doing research on the last few years is around using actual mathematical models rather than just manager intuition to build health scores,
Yes.
right?
I love
Really
that
predictive
you see
modeling,
that.
which was
Yeah.
something
I mean, now there's maybe some AI algos coming into place. But I do feel like that all this work that you've talked about, where you were applying mathematics in these call centers, on-prem software, it sounds like you were way ahead of the times, but still that's work that I don't see. And maybe companies don't have resources, right? Like experts to tackle that. But that seems like if you could even figure out today, saying to a product leader, for example, you know, all the product requests that we're getting are leading to this much cost, and this can be reduced if we
Yes.
fix X. Like that story, I always say to CS teams, that storytelling is so important. That product leader needs to understand what the revenue is at risk, right? When X doesn't happen. And we don't often do that well. So,
Right. So just to give you some perspective on how long I've been thinking about these problems, we did a project in 1995 and 1996 that then, we were able to, in a very crude way, analyze the content of calls that were coming in, train people to do that analysis, and then brought together the web team, the product team, the documentation team to take that input quantified with dollars attached to it to drive their roadmaps
wow.
and their changes. So I published that paper like 8 years later, 9 years later. And what I had said in the first draft of that paper is eventually the mechanical steps will be handled by AI, but the process things that we've implemented here will still be needed.
Mm-hmm. That's so
And the human component of that. So, yeah. I mean, what's happening now with AI, I think it's, what I was doing was, kind of falls under the heading of machine learning and AI. Gen AI has sort of captured the fancy and certainly addresses some of these process and quality control type problems in a way that's much cheaper and sort of better in some ways than doing these things manually. But the problems are still the same, which is we're gathering information. How do we translate that into better decisions and better choices?
Yeah. And how do we make sure we're gathering the information cleanly so that we can actually, I think that's how, and we're getting into a lot of practitioner space, but, being that we both are in this space, a lot of even the most sophisticated AI tools are barely going to be able to solve a problem if the data is inconsistent.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
well, so I want to talk to you. I want to shift back to career and shift and your kind of growth, because obviously this podcast is really helping our community see the future, right, of what's possible for them. And for somebody that came to the US pretty early, like you were a young person when my dad first came too. And my dad didn't
Yes.
me for I was like 15 years later. So I think this is really interesting to hear. You decided to start this new program. You got a little, free reign from the MBA school, but I imagine it's not all easy peasy, right? Like give us a little of what were some of the challenges to overcome to really convince people that what you were trying to build was invaluable? I'm curious about that.
Well, a couple of things. Just my starting point was within our MBA program because that's where I've been teaching essentially all of my classes for the last 15 or 16 years. And so there were some in the customer success community that didn't feel like, well, we don't really need MBAs. They're overpriced. And that I kind of had some evidence because I had a bunch of my MBAs that had been hired. But the niche then, and then how it's evolved, the niche then was, hey, we've got an application that's so complex that it's going to cut across organizational boundaries. And you're going to need people in the CS roles that can speak to account. I'm thinking of I had a handful of students that went to work at Zuora. And so their skills as MBA students and MBA grads was, hey, we can talk to accounting, we can talk to sales, we can talk to product really effectively. So the kind of applications that MBAs naturally grasp if they go into CS or product for that matter are things that are sort of more, I kind of think of the SaaS world as we're actually either selling you technology to go into your technology to make it better, or we're selling you a technology to go into your business to make it run better. And so my students tended to fall on the first side, but that was one objection was, hey, do we really need MBAs in these roles?
That's a good one.
Another one was simply classroom work isn't enough, right? And so one of the things that was baked into our program from day one is that every student works on either one or two consulting projects with a client as they're in school. SaaS company, typically the CS group, although increasingly in the last few years with AI, we've been working with product teams more around, hey, what's a question that you have, a problem that you have that you know is important? It's always on your list and the quarter finishes and you haven't gotten to it. And so that experiential learning for the students was another objection to overcome to help them get hired. They would come out with stories, with experiences, and with references.
Yeah. Well, that's it.
I was just to say that as a professor running this program, I'm a CSM. Every year I get a bunch of new logos in. Those are my students. But my outcomes are not, did I teach them, not the activity, but what were their placements?
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think you also have like do your logos come back to do more projects? Like,
Yes,
I always say to everyone, like, no matter what your industry is, there is a retention measure for you. It might not look the same. It might
yes,
be a referral metric, right? Something that your community gives back when you've delivered value. Okay, well, we're gonna wrap it up because we're
yes.
just about time, but I want to ask you one last question.
Okay.
Your journey has been really rich. If you had to dial it back to your young self, maybe back in Duluth or before you went to college, what was that? What was that like? Put your mindset back. And what's one lesson that you could share from the journey today with that young person that, might help them better navigate the future?
I think for our audience, our South Asian audience, the thing that I really want to hammer on is don't fear failure. Failure is a gift because there's so many lessons you learn when things don't work out the way that you'd planned. And I kind of look at every single significant success I've had in my life has been rooted in something that went wrong. So I love to talk about starting a consulting company at age 29. But really, the only reason that I started that company is I was so miserable and I'd chosen so badly for my first job out of grad school that I was hungry and motivated. So similarly, when we sold our business, I kicked myself. I felt like I didn't negotiate as good a deal as I would have liked to in hindsight. But those 2 years with the acquiring company were really what set me up to launch this customer success program. Because I was part of an executive team and I was running all of professional services, and I learned so much by being in-house rather than third party in
Mm.
that. But at the time, I thought I'd made a terrible deal and I was kicking myself. So I think there's so much pressure to support the goals and dreams of our parents in our community and to honor them. And I think that's all wonderful. At the same time, we live in an environment now that's harder for the previous generations to recognize because so much less of it is linear outside of a few narrow professions. And so, my world, there's nothing worse than getting to the wrong answer slowly. So, you know, just accept and embrace the idea that not all the choices you make are going to work out, and to not get down on yourself for that, but to see that as part of the journey and part of the growth, frankly.
I love that. That's such a wonderful sort of thought to share. And I especially feel like for our community of high achievers, high expectations, giving yourself grace to fail is something that we can all learn from. So,
And also to kind of redefine success for ourselves in a way that's maybe different than our parents. And I sort of recognize that our parents didn't have the leeway. They didn't have the space to meander. They didn't have the space to stumble and fall. It felt really clearly like our presence here in this country was conditional upon us being successful. Much honor, much respect, much support. But for the next generation, the generation after that, in the world that we're in now, it's a process of finding your way because I'll close with a quote from one of my favorite bands from Minnesota, The Replacements. God, what a mess on the ladder of success. You take a wrong step and you miss the whole first rung. And right, so that ladder and that how you get started, the doorways into adulthood are harder and harder to see. I say this as somebody whose daughter just graduated from college 3 weeks ago and I'm watching her do it. And so know that that's going to require you to stumble and it's going to require you to struggle a bit in a way that maybe your parents aren't going to understand or your grandparents aren't going to understand. And that's okay. The important thing is that you keep going forward.
wow, that's wonderful. Such great advice. And, I honestly, this was an awesome conversation. I know we could have probably talked for longer and we have so much more to share, but this was a wonderful insight into your journey, your career, and now, kind of moving into the next phases of
Yeah.
giving grace to your children, right? As we
Yes.
gave grace to ourselves. So thank you so much, Vijay. It was wonderful to have you, and I look forward to sharing this episode with everyone.
Thanks, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. Great to talk to you.
Well, thanks, everyone, and see you back for another episode of South Asian Success. Have a great day. Thank you for listening to South Asian Success. If this episode resonated with you, we hope that you'll share it with a friend or someone else who could resonate with it as well. And if you love what we're doing and building, Please do rate us on whatever podcast method you stream on. Any reviews will help us grow and improve this platform. And if you are interested in joining us or talking more about your journey, please be sure to reach out. Take care.